One day she was there standing quietly behind Britain's future king. The next, she vanished without a trace. No farewell photos, no public tribute, no explanation. But what happened behind those walls would soon turn whispers into a global uproar. For nearly a decade, Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo was a constant in Prince George's life, a woman whose presence was both invisible and irreplaceable. Appointed when George was just an infant, she became more than just a caretaker. She was a silent protector, a quiet anchor in a world spinning with public scrutiny, royal expectations, and calculated appearances. Her face was rarely captured in press photos, yet within the palace walls, her voice soothed the cries of a future king, her hands packed his schoolbags, and her wisdom shaped his understanding of the world. She knew every nuance of his personality, what made him laugh, what comforted him at night, what unsettled him before big events. Maria wasn't a name on the royal staff list. She was a part of the boy's soul. And then, as if overnight, she was gone. No formal dismissal, no official statement from the palace, no warm tribute or carefully choreographed send-off. Her exit came not with ceremony, but with silence. The media caught wind only after the fact, puzzled by her abrupt absence. Insiders were baffled. Royal reporters whispered of a quiet falling out behind the gates. Some speculated that it was a shift in internal power, a clash of ideals between the old guard of hands-on nurturers and the new wave of image-minded strategists surrounding George's development. Others hinted at something deeper, an unspoken conflict, perhaps even a betrayal, that had forced a separation no one saw coming. But beyond the speculation and the silence, the most jarring reaction came from the one heart that mattered most to Prince George himself. Close observers noted a change. His cheerful demeanor turned subdued. His usual spark seemed dimmed. To the world, he was still smiling on balconies and waving at parades. But behind the palace walls, the boy who once clung to Maria's coat now sat quietly at dinner, asking questions his parents weren't ready to answer. Had she been taken away? Had she chosen to leave him? Or had something far more complicated unraveled beneath the surface? Because this wasn't just a departure. This wasn't a quiet end to a contract. It was something that rattled the very fabric of trust within the monarchy. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the absence of Maria became more than a mystery. It became a symbol of change, of a growing prince, of a vanishing childhood, of a family holding on to traditions that no longer fit into the future they were constructing. But to understand why this silent exit shook the palace, we must rewind to a time when Maria wasn't just a nanny, but the heartbeat of the nursery. Before she ever stepped foot inside the iron gates of Kensington Palace, Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo had already mastered the art of vanishing, not in body, but in presence. At Norland College, the elite training ground for those who would one day care for the children of presidents, billionaires, and monarchs, Maria didn't just learn how to change nappies or prepare nutritious meals. She was sculpted into something far rarer, a silent sentinel of childhood. At Norland, excellence wasn't a goal, it was a commandment. Her days were spent mastering emergency response drills, studying child psychology, memorizing etiquette protocols, and learning how to comfort a screaming toddler while a security threat unfolded 2 rooms away. It was there, in those hallowed halls of invisible service, that Maria pledged herself not just to a job, but to a mission that would demand her heart, soul, and anonymity. So, when Prince William and Catherine began the search for someone who would do more than protect their son, someone who would understand the emotional pressure of raising a child born into the monarchy, Maria's name rose like a whisper among polished resumes. But this wasn't a standard interview. The Duke and Duchess weren't hiring a nanny. They were selecting a guardian for the soul of the crown. They didn't need credentials, they needed trust. Over weeks, their team combed through her history, tested her instincts, watched how she reacted under stress, and listened not just to what she said, but to what she chose not to say. In the end, it wasn't her answers that won their confidence. It was her silence. Maria didn't sell herself. She promised discretion. And for the royals, that was louder than any reference letter ever could be. When she finally arrived at Kensington, it was as if she'd slipped in under cover of fog. No announcement, no cameras, no official confirmation, Just a new face behind the nursery doors, dressed in Norland brown, arriving before dawn, slipping out after dark. While the world debated George's baby outfits and royal christenings, Maria was tiptoeing down palace hallways, memorizing the sound of his breathing, logging feeding times, and learning the rhythm of a newborn's cries before he even knew what his needs were. She wasn't hired to stand out. She was trained to disappear to become part of the palace walls, an emotional shadow, unseen but ever present. From the beginning, Maria understood that this wasn't just a job, it was a lifelong oath to remain the invisible hand, shaping a boy who would never know a normal day. She didn't crave closeness. She earned it, moment by moment. While others addressed George as a prince, Maria spoke to him as a person. And within weeks, even palace aides began to notice the shift. George, usually shy with staff, began reaching for her hand without prompting. During photo ops, he looked past the cameras to her. He cried less when she was around. He smiled more when she whispered something in Spanish before he went to sleep. She became, without ceremony or spotlight, the anchor in a life defined by spectacle. No press ever captured her story. No document recorded the nights she spent awake during fevers or the moments when a child's fear outweighed royal decorum. But inside those walls, Maria wasn't just a nanny. She was the soft voice in a loud world, the silent strength behind a fragile boy with a world on his shoulders. And as George took his first steps, it wasn't the world watching him, it was Maria, quietly shaping a boy destined for a crown. Inside the nursery, where the clicking of cameras could never intrude and royal protocol dissolved into warm quiet, something extraordinary began to take root. It wasn't part of any official duty or written rule. It wasn't assigned or measured or reported to the palace office. It simply existed organic, undeniable, and quietly transformative. What Maria Teresa Turrion Borrallo created with Prince George wasn't just structure or care, it was a sanctuary. From the moment she held him in her arms, she chose to see him not as the crown's property or the monarchy's heir, but as a boy, fragile, sensitive, searching for something that titles could never offer: unconditional love. Where others bowed, Maria listened. Where others maintained formality, she offered warmth. She didn't speak to him like royalty, and he didn't look at her like a staff. In that small, hushed space between them, a language of trust formed. She sang him lullabies in her native Spanish, soft melodies threaded with emotion from a childhood lived in a different world. It wasn't just noise to calm him, it was the kind of soothing that made a child feel rooted, known. And long before he could form words, she already knew what he needed. A certain tilt of his head meant he was overwhelmed. A hand tug at his ear signaled fatigue. A distant gaze was a silent cry for reassurance. She understood his moods as though they were her own. When George finally did speak, his first word wasn't to his parents, nor was it rehearsed for a royal engagement. It was a simple murmur spoken in the safe, familiar quiet of the nursery: "Baba." A word not found in any Norland handbook, not taught or trained, but deeply felt. He spoke to her, and it would never be forgotten. In that moment, the invisible line that separated staff from family blurred. Maria wasn't replacing his mother. She wasn't competing with Catherine or trying to claim emotional ground. She simply became what every child needs at least once in their life: someone who loved them without agenda. Days passed in quiet rituals that only they understood. George's giggles echoed in the spaces between nap times and snack breaks. There were no grand gestures, no royal directives, just soft hands straightening his collar, whispered stories on stormy afternoons, and tiny comforts offered with perfect timing. When the palace grew tense, when the noise of the outside world pressed in with headlines and camera flashes, Maria absorbed the pressure like a shield. She gave George space to play, space to cry, space to be a child before he was ever expected to be a symbol. And through it all, she planted seeds not just of discipline, but of grace. She didn't just teach George how to behave, she taught him how to feel, how to identify the sadness of others, how to listen with his eyes, how to recognize kindness even in silence. She asked questions that encouraged curiosity. Why do you think she's crying? What do you think happens to butterflies when they sleep? She wasn't preparing him for pageantry, she was preparing him for personhood. And perhaps that's what made their bond so powerful and so dangerous to a system that prized image over emotion. But time has no mercy, even in palaces. As George grew, so too did the invisible wall that separates childhood from destiny. It didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement, no sudden shift that shouted the end. Instead, it came in fragments. A missed morning greeting, a shorter bedtime story, the soft closing of a nursery door that no longer needed to be opened every hour. For Maria, the changes were almost imperceptible at first, like a familiar melody, losing its rhythm note by note. But she noticed. Because no one was more attuned to Prince George's world than the woman who had once been at the center of it. And now, she was being moved to the margins not by cruelty or command, but by something far more difficult to resist: time. As George entered formal schooling, the palace routine restructured itself. Mornings once reserved for playful chatter over breakfast were now overtaken by rigid schedules. Uniforms replaced pajamas, classrooms replaced crafts, and royal tutors, hand-selected and highly vetted, began occupying the hours Maria used to fill with emotional warmth. Suddenly, there were new faces everywhere: protocol advisors, press coaches, speech experts. Each one brought something valuable, but collectively, they began reshaping the life Maria had so carefully built around the boy she had raised to feel, not just perform. Her days grew shorter, her duties lighter. The gentle lullabies were replaced by strict bedtime windows. The nursery became quieter, not from peace, but absence. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, something had shifted in the atmosphere. A subtle tension began pulsing through the palace corridors. Maria, once the heartbeat of George's emotional life, now found herself increasingly irrelevant in conversations about his future. She wasn't being dismissed outright. That would have been too harsh, too obvious. Instead, she was being slowly edged out by a tide of progress cloaked in professionalism. Development specialists praised efficiency. Image consultants whispered about modern optics. Behind closed doors, the narrative was evolving. The future king needed shaping not just in heart, but in mind and image. And Maria, with all her gentleness and tradition, no longer fit that new mold. Still, she held her ground. Quietly, firmly. She did not plead or protest, but continued to show up with the same unwavering devotion she always had. She adjusted his uniforms, packed his favorite snacks, waited in the hall after long days to hear how his classes went, even when his answers came in distracted monosyllables. But her presence, once effortless, now felt like a question mark no one wanted to address. And the unspoken conflict between what was warm and what was modern only deepened behind palace walls. Some insiders championed her legacy, urging that emotional grounding mattered as much as public poise. Others pushed forward, citing strategy, optics, and evolution. The monarchy had entered a new phase, and Maria, for all her loyalty, didn't come with the blueprint. George, too, was changing, not in affection, but in awareness. He asked more questions now. He studied people longer. His once easy smiles became more considered. He was learning to navigate the rules, the roles, the expectations that came with his title. And though he still turned to Maria, still sought her out in quieter moments, their time together felt shorter, thinner, stretched across a life that no longer paused for stories or slow afternoons. He was still her boy, but less and less the boy who needed her every hour. And then came the day no one had prepared her for, not even herself. The moment the crown gently closed the door on the woman who had given everything. It wasn't a confrontation. No voices were raised. There was no drama, no slamming of doors, no thunderous decree echoing through the gilded halls. It was too quiet. Just three people seated in a room that had witnessed so many beginnings now bearing witness to an end. Maria sat across from William and Catherine, her hands resting in her lap, her face composed, serene. But beneath that stillness, something was unraveling. Years of devotion, of whispered lullabies, of holding space for a child destined to become a monarch, now reduced to a conversation no one wanted to have. William spoke first. His tone was respectful, measured, not out of coldness, but from the weight of the role he carried. Catherine nodded beside him, her posture perfect, but her eyes betraying the emotion that her lips refused to express. And then came the words that would fracture everything. "Maria, your time is done." The sentence floated in the air like a phantom, soft but devastating. It wasn't a dismissal in tone, but it was final in substance. They spoke kindly, praised her dedication, thanked her for being George's constant for nearly a decade. They acknowledged the sacrifice, the tireless care, the countless nights spent holding his hand through illness or fear. But it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. George had grown. His life had changed. The institution was moving forward, and she, Maria, would not be coming with it. She listened in silence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew saying anything now wouldn't change what had already been decided behind palace doors. Catherine's voice quivered slightly when she added, "We thought you should choose when, but George already knows. He wants to speak with you." And that was when Maria felt it, the moment her heart split just slightly. Not from betrayal, not from shock, but from the unbearable ache of inevitability. She had always known this day would come, but knowing doesn't soften the blow. Maria rose gently, nodded once, and left the room without shedding a single tear. Her dignity was intact. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. She walked the familiar corridors of Kensington like someone tracing the last steps of a life they once lived. Every creak of the wooden floors, every faded photograph on the walls whispered memories back at her. Moments no one else had seen. Laughter that belonged only to her and George. She passed the nursery without looking in. She didn't have the strength. Instead, she found him where she always knew she would, by the window, sketching. He stood when he saw her. Not startled, not angry, just solemn. "Mom told me," he said, voice barely audible. "I don't want things to change." Maria smiled, the kind of smile built from 1,000 unspoken moments. "You're growing up," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "And it's time." He didn't argue, he didn't cry, but he looked at her as if trying to memorize every line of her face. Like a boy who knew this wasn't just goodbye, it was the end of something sacred. And maybe he was right. Because later that night, Maria walked alone through the halls one last time, memories trailing behind her like shadows. She didn't stop to say farewell. There were no goodbyes from staff, no photos, no royal press statements. Just the echo of quiet footsteps and a silent promise left unspoken. But even as she left the palace quietly, the storm her absence would trigger had only just begun. Before she vanished, before the world could even ask where she'd gone, Prince George handed her a small, clumsily wrapped package. The paper was crinkled, the tape uneven, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the trembling handwriting on the note attached, "Thank you for being my first teacher." Inside, folded with the innocence of a child who hadn't yet learned how heavy words can become, was a leather-bound notebook, empty but full of meaning. The kind of gift that speaks not of royalty, not of obligation, but of love that had taken root in places no institution could ever reach. It was his goodbye, simple, quiet, and devastating. And when Maria opened it, alone in the dim light of the staff quarters, the composure she had fought to preserve finally broke. She didn't sob loudly or collapse to the ground. Her breakdown was silent. It came in the form of trembling hands, a bitten lip, and eyes that refused to stop filling. She had given nearly a decade to the boy who now stood on the precipice of royal adolescence. She had whispered to him through nightmares, bandaged scraped knees, taught him kindness not through lectures but through example. And in return, he gave her something no crown could offer, a memory that would never fade, a truth that would never be spoken aloud but would forever live between the pages of that empty notebook. A final message, etched not in ink, but in feeling, "You mattered." There were no farewell dinners, no teary-eyed send-offs from senior royals, no glossy palace photos honoring her years of service. That wasn't how Maria operated. She had entered the palace without noise, and she would leave the same way. As the sun began to rise, she walked slowly through the palace gardens. The same path she had taken countless times with George, watching him chase butterflies, listening to his questions about the sky, picking up stones he insisted were treasures. But this time, she walked alone. The dew on the grass sparkled like unspoken memories, and every step felt like saying goodbye to a chapter no one else had read. Her final breakfast with George was hushed. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. He sat beside her, eating quietly, his leg occasionally brushing against hers beneath the table. When he finished, he handed her a folded napkin with another note inside. "I won't forget." She smiled but didn't answer. What could she say? She had already said everything worth saying in the thousands of moments they had shared, most of them undocumented, but none of them forgotten. When she packed her belongings, it all fit into a single suitcase. She had never collected much. A few uniforms. A framed picture George had drawn when he was 5 was a wobbly castle, a stick figure with brown hair, and a heart drawn beside it. And of course, the notebook. That was all. No fanfare. No final words. Just her walking through the staff corridor one last time, her shoes echoing against the polished floors like fading footsteps in a sacred place. She exited the palace the way she had entered it, through the staff entrance, invisible to the public, unseen by the cameras. But she disappeared from royal life without a sound. The noise she was about to make would be deafening. 8 months passed in silence. No headlines, no interviews, no appearances. Maria had vanished, just as expected, folding herself back into a life the palace believed she had left behind without resistance. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. And then, without warning, her name surfaced again quietly, carefully, in a message not from the palace press team, not from royal protocol staff, but from someone far more significant. Prince George had asked for her, not for a ceremony, not for closure. He needed her for guidance, for courage, for something no royal tutor or PR consultant could provide. He was preparing for his first major solo public appearance, a high-profile engagement that would thrust him into the world not as a child, but as an emerging symbol of the monarchy's future. The pressure was enormous, the anxiety is unbearable, and when asked whom he wanted by his side in preparation, he gave only one name. Catherine hesitated. The request wasn't small. It meant breaking the quiet finality of Maria's exit. But in the end, maternal instinct overrode political caution. Without alerting the press, she reached out discreetly. A car was sent. No uniform, no attention. Maria returned through the same staff entrance she had once walked out of, her presence cloaked in shadows, her return unannounced. But this time, she wasn't there as a nanny. She wasn't there to raise him. She was there to steady him, to remind him of the quiet truths that once anchored him before the world demanded his voice. Their reunion was not loud or dramatic. George didn't run into her arms. There were no tears. But something deeper passed between them the moment their eyes met. An understanding. A thread, never severed, simply waiting to be picked up again. Maria knew exactly what to do. She walked him through the schedule, helped him rehearse his lines, prepped his wardrobe, even packed a familiar snack in the inside pocket of his coat. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer advice unless he asked. But when his hands trembled before rehearsal, she placed hers over his and whispered the same phrase she had once murmured during thunderstorm nights in the nursery, "You're not alone." On the final day before the appearance, George handed her another folded piece of paper. It was a drawing of another wobbly image of a dog, this one named Marta. No explanation, no words. Just a quiet reminder that some bonds don't fade, they evolve. Maria smiled, tucked it into her coat, and left again. No one saw her go. There were no photos, no statements. But something had shifted. This second departure wasn't marked by sadness, it was marked by quiet resolve. She had returned not as a servant, but as a guide. Not as someone who belonged to the palace, but as someone whose absence had never truly taken hold in the boy who once called her his first teacher. And the palace, so confident that Maria's chapter had ended, believed that would be the last time she would be mentioned. But they were wrong. Because Maria had one final act to deliver, and it would make global headlines. She could have disappeared. She had every right to. After nearly a decade inside the palace, Maria could have accepted her silence as permanent, retreated into comfort, and lived a quiet, anonymous life. She had been offered it, after all, a generous financial package, lifelong privacy, even a villa abroad should she wish to vanish from the public forever. And no one would have blamed her. She had seen too much, given too much, and left with far too little. But instead of fading away, Maria did something no one predicted. She re-emerged not to tell her story, not to expose secrets, not to cash in on the quiet power she held, but to build something entirely new. Something for the world's forgotten children. Something for those without a voice. Without a Maria of their own. With no formal press release, no big interview, and no royal endorsement, she quietly launched a global nonprofit from a modest office in West London. Its mission? To provide emotional development and support resources to children from broken homes, foster care systems, and displaced families across the globe. It wasn't about education, it was about connection. Her foundation didn't teach children how to perform, it taught them how to feel safe, how to trust, how to be seen. And when asked because the world was desperate to know why she, of all people, had chosen to dedicate her second act to this, she gave only one answer: because every child deserves someone who sees them. And then came the video. It appeared on the Foundation's new website, almost like a whisper in a storm. No sponsors, no celebrity tie-in, just Maria, sitting in a quiet room, reading children's books in both Spanish and English. The simplicity of it was staggering. There were no flashy graphics, no staged theatrics, just her voice, calm and steady, like it had been 1,000 times in the nursery of Kensington Palace. And in that moment, the public saw what George had always known. This woman wasn't royalty, but she carried more nobility in her presence than any crown ever could. The reaction was instant. Royal watchers broke down in tears. Social media flooded with praise, admiration, and stunned disbelief. Newspapers who once speculated on scandal now wrote of selfless grace. The monarchy didn't comment, but silence from the palace only confirmed what everyone suspected they hadn't seen coming. And then, quietly, donations began to roll in. From everyday parents, from former Norland nannies, from teachers, counselors, nurses, but also, curiously, from anonymous donors, some large, some significant. One in particular caught the eye of insiders. A private transfer, marked only with the initials GAC. Speculation swirled, but no confirmation ever came. Still, those close to Maria suspected what she already knew in her heart George hadn't forgotten. Maria didn't speak about the palace. Not once. Not when asked. Not even when pressed. She refused interviews, declined memoir offers, and never revealed a single private detail about her time with the royal family. It wasn't loyalty to the crown, it was love for a boy who had once clung to her sweater on stormy nights and whispered questions about the stars. Her silence was her final protection. Her work, her quiet rebellion. And while the world applauded, one young prince watched from afar, knowing her story wasn't just about what she left behind, but what she'd planted deep within him. She may never walk the palace halls again. Her footsteps may never echo down the corridors where once she hummed lullabies and packed school bags with quiet precision. But her presence hasn't vanished. It lives on not in headlines or photographs, but in the quiet strength of a boy learning to lead in a world that demands so much of him so soon. Prince George, now older, more composed, has stepped into the royal spotlight with a poise that has surprised even the most seasoned observers. Calm under pressure, thoughtful in his words, empathetic in moments where most expect rehearsed formality. And while his public image continues to evolve, insiders know the truth. The foundation of that emotional intelligence didn't come from royal tradition. It came from the woman who raised him when the cameras weren't watching. Maria's name is never spoken in public royal circles. She is not credited in speeches. She's not thanked in formal acknowledgments. But behind closed doors, where truth often escapes protocol, her influence is quietly respected. Aides who were there in those early years still recall the subtle shift she brought into the nursery, not just routines and structure, but depth, humanity. It's no coincidence, they whisper, that George handles discomfort with grace or that he listens before he speaks. Maria taught him that, not through lessons, but through living, through example, through every whispered reassurance when he stumbled, every soft correction when he faltered. She didn't shape a prince, she shaped a person. Meanwhile, the foundation she quietly launched has grown beyond expectation. What began as a modest program in London now operates in over a dozen countries, from schools in rural Africa to outreach centers in urban America. It isn't flashy, it doesn't boast celebrity endorsements, but its impact is unmistakable. Children who once felt invisible are learning to express themselves. Foster parents are being trained in emotional bonding. And teachers are echoing the phrase that has now become the Foundation's creed: every child deserves someone who sees them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.